But why do people tend to say that Marvel, in recent years, no longer attracts many people? We've seen in recent weeks that there are many factors that can explain this. But today, we're going to focus on a very specific point. Marvel's very poor management of the character's power, which often makes these movies predictable, or even downright uninteresting. This video, which I wrote with my buddy Captain Bambino, follows a first part in which I talked about Marvel's problems with managing the power of their characters in the Infinity Saga from 2008 to 2019. To sum it up briefly, after two initial phases without any major power clashes, Marvel found its miracle technique in Phase 3, isolating the opposition in order to raise the stakes. Even though, overall, the fights often stay the same, they have a hard time making very powerful characters interact without creating an imbalance. As a result, they often prefer to remove them from their stories, like Hulk in the early Avengers movies. I still recommend watching the first video before this one since it's more complex and interesting. As for this problem, it really became a bigger issue with the arrival of Captain Marvel in Endgame, a character they clearly didn't know what to do with, and who they either nerfed or removed from the plot. Today, we're going to tackle what comes next. How did the situation get worse for the MCU during the Multiverse saga? And why did we end up with a bunch of villains who were bigger losers than the last? Gore, Dar-Ben, Kang, MODOK, Cassandra Nova, and others. Hey, don't start attacking me about Kang. The character is awesome, yes, but in Quantumania, the ending just makes him look terrible. It was lame. Anyway, even though this video will mainly talk about projects that are already out, just in case, we're entering the spoiler zone. Danger Zone. You're with Kevin Buckhardt, the favorite theorist of your favorite overpowered character. Opening credits, it's Kevin Buckhardt. The Eternals and the Return of the Problem. After Avengers Endgame, Marvel finds itself trapped, and it's frustrating for the audience. We've had proof that an extremely powerful enemy could bring together all the heroes in the universe. In movies with very high stakes with epic battles, but from that point on, it's impossible to come down without breaking something. Marvel can no longer afford to introduce a big villain in just a series or a side project without creating the same old inconsistency. Why? The other heroes don't get involved. As a result, they're forced to limit the threats to much more modest stakes, so we suddenly go from Thanos to Agatha Harkness or the Flag Smasher. Obviously, the hype takes a hit, and that's probably one of the reasons for the growing lack of interest in the post-Endgame MCU. We went really high only to fall back into pretty basic confrontations. It seems like after 10 years of evolution, the universe is back to square one with threats. Still, Phase 4 actually starts off well. The confrontations remain balanced and sometimes even quite personal. Shang-Chi, for example, pits the hero against his own father. A film that, yes, uses some of the codes from the previous phase, but also brings something new. The fights are much more choreographed, and there's a real sense of leveling up, like in a video game. You fight henchmen, you level up, until the final boss, Wenwu, is basically a demon, and this structure works. No need for superhumans. Here, we're mainly dealing with very well-trained characters, but without cosmic powers, and it works. On top of that, this mix of grounded realism with fantasy, a touch of wuxia, and Chinese folklore is something we've never really seen in the MCU before. What we notice is that Marvel now handles power levels much more carefully. They learned their lesson after the Carol Danvers disaster, and since then, they don't really dare to introduce heroes who are too powerful anymore. Well, for now. Yelena Belova, Red Guardians, John Walker, and even Danira Mirez, they're all decent characters, but they clearly remind us of the types we saw in phases 1 and 2 nothing too risky. Marvel is afraid of messing up the narrative, so they're not innovating with the heroes or the villains until Eternals. With the Eternals, the studios are trying something really new, and they're giving a lot of freedom to Chloe Zhao, who just won an Oscar. But the movie is almost too different to fully fit in with the rest of the MCU. The characters are super powerful, yes, but now they have to explain why they never acted before. And of course, that creates tons of questions the movie keeps trying to explain away every 15 minutes.
5 years ago, Thanos wiped out half the population of the universe, but the people on this planet took it all in stride.
Marvel tends to remove or sideline overly powerful heroes soon after they debut because it's afraid to keep them in the lineup. Gilgamesh gets killed, Ikari commits suicide, and the strongest ones like Thena, Druig, or Makari are exiled into space, just like Hulk at the end of Age of Ultron. It's almost a caricature. On Earth, only Cersei, Phastos, Kingo, and Sprite are left, the least powerful ones, or at least those with powers that are a bit less intense than the others. Once again, they avoid any character that's too complicated to bring back in a potential big crossover. But Eternals doesn't stop there. The movie also introduces a huge threat, the Celestials. And again, there's a big consistency problem that everyone has talked about. Arishem shows up on Earth right in the stratosphere. Tiamut literally emerges from the oceans, and nobody reacts. No hero steps in or even mentions it. Nothing. Radio silence. It's almost unbelievable. Events like this should shake the entire universe. It's more shocking than the invasion of New York, yet it has no impact in later projects. We'll have to wait for Captain America. Brave New World, 4 years later, before there's even a first reference to any of this. And by the way, there are also the Deviants. But well, I guess you've already forgotten them. Me too, since they're so insignificant. And yet, despite all that, the Eternals really try to offer something new and beautiful. But unfortunately, this newness doesn't fit well into the MCU system. The formula that worked so well during Phase 3, namely isolating conflicts in another dimension or an area apart from the rest of the universe to better integrate them later, is completely abandoned here. Here, the Eternals' actions are public and should draw attention from other heroes. None of the earlier approaches appear to be used. As if there was no more internal communication, both within the MCU and at Marvel Studios. They have the keys to success, but they're just throwing them away. And the reason is pretty simple. Marvel Studios is overproducing. In just a few months, they've gone from 2 or 3 movies a year to 4 movies and 5 series. Kevin Feige is everywhere. Overloaded, he's supervising too many projects at once, and is even being sidelined. He used to be the mastermind behind the entire MCU, but now he's nowhere to be found, and you can feel it. Because in itself, offering very different one-shots isn't necessarily a bad idea, but within the MCU, it's almost impossible to justify. Unless you do like with the Fantastic Four, move the action to another universe. And then of course it works much better. Because you break free from those familiar conventions, those constraints, and you can tell a truly new story without having to worry about a shared universe. Marvel is sinking into the abyss. In the second part of Phase 4, Marvel keeps making mistakes in how they handle their characters. This time, they introduce big villains, but for extremely personal stakes. And it starts with the very next movie, Spider-Man: No Way Home. The action takes place right in the heart of New York. Some of Spider-Man's most fearsome enemies from across the multiverse are causing chaos in the city. Even worse, reality itself is breaking. And yet, everything seems to revolve only around Peter, as if we were in Sam Raimi's universe where only Spider-Man can make it through. In short, villains are obviously nerfed in fights that are unreadable or even downright invisible. From the moment the fight starts between the 3 Peters and the 4 antagonists, the battle barely lasts 3 minutes flat. And if you pay close attention, there's almost no real showdown. The heroes are running away more than they're actually fighting. And the characters who get the most screen time at that moment are Ned and MJ. 2 civilians. And we find the same problem in Moon Knight. As soon as a fight gets really interesting, we're simply deprived of the action. Because Stephen and Mark are replaced by Jake Lockley, who never actually appears on screen. In both cases, the action is systematically set aside in favor of a more or less effective exploration of the character's psychology, so it's a choice. But it's a choice that ends up frustrating the viewers, and in No Way Home, we also have Doctor Strange, let me remind you. A character we haven't really talked about here yet, because in his first movie, he was still just an apprentice, but in Infinity War and Endgame, we discover the full extent of his powers. And delivers one of the most beautiful fights in the MCU. At that moment, Strange becomes one of the most powerful characters in the entire universe, and that's why in Endgame he's just kept busy holding back a dam. And yes, he's barely present in the fight. So yeah, his presence in the movie makes sense. You don't leave Doctor Strange at the Sanctum when the multiverse is going crazy. But again, he gets beaten in his own mirror dimension by Peter Parker with math. And so, he stays stuck until the end of the movie.
Strange, wait, we're so close!
Skip it. I've been dangling over the Grand Canyon for 12 hours.
I know.
Doesn't that remind you of something? The problem isn't just that he lost. His behavior has changed. He's less thoughtful, more impulsive. He's not the surgeon we knew. Nothing like the guy in Infinity War who was willing to let Peter die to save the universe. He wasn't just nerfed. It feels like he was rewritten for the script. Now, there is still a reason for that, but it's not any better than just bad writing. Originally, Multiverse of Madness and No Way Home were supposed to be switched. The Spidey movie was supposed to come out after. And this Strange was actually supposed to be the Sinister Strange from the collapsing universe. That's why he's so weird. But anyway, then comes Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, with a formidable antagonist, the Scarlet Witch, who clearly has the WandaVision vibe. She's probably the most powerful human villain in all of Phase 4, maybe even the whole MCU, honestly. And here, that's a good idea. The conflict takes place in other universes. That helps avoid inconsistencies and long-winded explanations. But even here, there's no real showdown between Strange and Wanda, even though we know perfectly well that he can go toe-to-toe with her. Even with the Illuminati, everything is rushed. Black Bolt, who is supposed to be the most dangerous, is taken out first because of some information casually given away by Reed Richards, who, I remind you, is meant to be the world's smartest mind. Wanda, Black Bolt can destroy you with just a whisper from his mouth. He literally explained to her how to neutralize him.
What mouth?
And in the end, it's not the heroes who defeat Wanda, she's the one who backs down. And that's where we ask a real question. How can the MCU handle a threat as powerful as Wanda or Thanos? Someone willing to kill instantly. Maybe Doctor Doom in his omnipotent form in Secret Wars. In reality, to create real stakes, Marvel will seriously have to make its heroes mortal. I can't imagine a battle against Doom without any deaths or injuries, because that's also what makes enemies truly formidable. But for now, it's the enemies who are too powerful that get eliminated. Like with Wanda, who is immediately considered dead, until we need her again someday, obviously. Same for Strange, who leaves Universe 616 at the end of the movie. Once again, at this point, it's almost become a caricature. As soon as a character becomes too powerful, they get kicked out. Love and Thunder, for its part, introduces Omnipotent City, a city of gods designed to unite the universe's most powerful entities. So logically, it should set the groundwork for the hierarchy of power in the MCU, but if you look closely, there's no credible threat. Zeus is turned into a joke, and yet he's supposed to be the god of gods. And without his lightning bolt in the movie, he's absolutely worthless. And on top of that, they waste Russell Crowe for nothing. The others are just there to make jokes. Look up there, guys, that's the Chronon God. Nini of the Nani. Hey Nini Nani, you can spot 2 or 3 Celestials, but they literally do nothing. In the end, all these gods are just extras. And that's normal. If Thor really had to go up against them, he'd get destroyed. So, to avoid having to write that kind of fight, they just don't do it. The gods are useless. They stay passive. But this kind of writing has huge consequences for the villain Gore. Because Gore is the God Butcher. He's supposed to be the killer of deities. In the comics, he goes on a crusade against all the gods to get revenge for the death of his family, armed with a fearsome necrosword, which could have created the MCU's most incredible scenes. And in the movie, he kills 0 gods on screen. Like 0. All he does is leave and kidnap children. That's what Gore, the God Butcher, has become. And of course, by making the gods ridiculous, they had to tone down Gore to keep some sort of balance. Anyway, these 3 movies had insane potential. They could have become classics of the genre, but they were all ruined by one thing: the power scale. Not a single action scene is memorable, and no confrontation is truly iconic. The start of a good idea. Ant-Man and Quantumania had great promise, but it didn't solve the power scaling problem either. Kang, who claims to have defeated the Avengers from several universes, struggles against Ant-Man and his old buddies, an army of ants. He loses in a hand-to-hand fight against an aging Scott who doesn't use his powers. Still, this movie at least introduced an interesting idea. A new way to build up a villain's power on the MCU scale across several movies. Apart from Loki, who is one of the few antagonists to have had real development across several projects, no other MCU villain had received such treatment. Starting out as a minor figure with weaknesses, going through failures, and gradually evolving until becoming a major threat. Yet that's one of the pillars of Marvel storytelling in the comics. Villains who fall, but come back, grow, and end up having more and more weight in the universe. This is an element often overlooked by the MCU, which for too long favored the one-shot villain. And with Kang, you could feel that Marvel finally wanted to change that. They introduced us to a human conqueror, vulnerable, full of doubts, whose flaws made him truly interesting. It's the perfect opportunity to start a slow but controlled rise until he becomes the final boss of a big Avengers movie. An idea that I personally find brilliant, an approach I've always supported, which could have been perfect for the MCU, and we would have loved to see this threat grow, appear in several projects, challenging each hero through his variants and manipulations. But that trajectory was cut short. The Kang Dynasty was cancelled, Jonathan Majors was fired at the end of 2023, and all that narrative ambition was left by the wayside. And at that point, it was too late to quickly shift toward Doctor Doom in the same pattern. Yet, it's a model that works. Introduce a villain in a limited setting, have him face secondary threats, then build him up until he becomes the central evil figure in a crossover. That's exactly what Spider-Verse succeeded in doing with the Spot. In Into the Spider-Verse, he's just an extra who gets hit in the head with a bagel. In Across the Spider-Verse, he starts out as a half-pathetic loser, but as the movie goes on, he becomes more and more unsettling. And in the end, he's the inevitable adversary, a perfectly written rise in power. If Beyond the Spider-Verse ends well, it will prove this method works, and Marvel should consider taking inspiration from it. But I think they've understood, since there are rumors about the return of Ultron and the inclusion of Annihilus in several movies.
L'ère des vilains nuls.
After that, Marvel enters a rather bleak era. Most of the new antagonists become rather poorly developed, largely watered down compared to their comic book versions, and very often cartoonish. On paper, these villains represented major threats. But on screen, they are weakened, not very threatening, and almost always end up sabotaging themselves or losing because of their own mistakes. Without the heroes even needing to be particularly brilliant or strategic. They don't even need to, actually. The villains do the job for them. This phenomenon in the MCU has become more pronounced recently. Gore in Love and Thunder sacrifices himself to bring his daughter back, and Wanda in Multiverse of Madness also sacrifices herself, but for a much more unclear reason. Darwin in the Marvels dies from a power overload all by herself. MODOK in Quantumania basically seems to commit suicide by trying to defy Kang to become a good guy.
At least I die. As an Avenger.
Yeah.
Kang actually retrieves the heart of his multiversal machine so he can leave, but he doesn't, and we don't really know why. Cassandra Nova? She doesn't even care about what the heroes are doing to stop her, and as a result, she dies. The Jinns in Miss Marvel follow exactly the same pattern. They're presented as threatening, but in the end they're dispatched without any resistance. And while the villains collapse on their own, the heroes themselves stagnate, or even regress. Marvel is having more and more trouble developing its main characters. Sam Wilson in Captain America 4 Scott Lang in his third movie, or even Thor in Thor 4, he doesn't evolve anymore. And even worse, some are downright nerfed. Again. Captain Marvel, for example, in Endgame can literally destroy Thanos' entire fleet. And in the Marvels, she struggles against 3 of Darwin's henchmen, with yet another totally random element that deprives her of her powers. And as if that wasn't enough, Monica Rambeau and even Kamala Khan are also weakened in the same movie. All of this just to even the odds against a villain who, in any case, is absolutely pathetic. In fact, what we're seeing is a lowering of standards. With weaker villains, heroes also become less powerful, creating a dull cycle where no one pushes themselves. That's the opposite of what a superhero movie should be. A good movie usually needs a strong villain. A villain who pushes the hero to his limits and forces him to evolve and find solutions. The quality of a comic book movie depends more on the threat than the hero. And today, the MCU has lost part of its essence. The fight between good and evil, where heroes had to show courage, surpass themselves, and face threats greater than themselves. Now, conflicts resolve themselves. Heroes no longer need to push themselves to their limits. And all of that makes everything less epic, less engaging, less memorable. And the heroes? Lately, Marvel has more or less slowed down the massive introduction of overpowered characters. The studio continues to introduce a few while looking for story solutions to avoid unbalancing the universe. 3 recent examples illustrate the strategies used: Adam Warlock in Guardians of the Galaxy, 3 Gaia in Secret Invasion, and Bob Sentry in Thunderbolt. Let's start with Adam Warlock. Teased at the end of Guardians 2, he shows up in the opening minutes of the 3rd film with huge potential, but James Gunn himself admitted he didn't know what to do with this character. As a result, Warlock is intentionally held back. Sure, he's very powerful, but he's treated like a newborn child. Naive, clumsy, sometimes missing the point. He makes mistakes, makes bad decisions, and ends up being sidelined for a good part of the film. As a result, apart from his dramatic entrance and his role in the first 20 minutes, he remains mostly secondary and not very interesting. This choice keeps him from stealing the spotlight, but also robs him of charisma, despite being one of comics' most iconic characters. This is further proof that, in the MCU, the way power is handled can completely distort the adaptation of a character. The case of Gaia in Secret Invasion is different, but no less problematic. At the end of the series, she literally acquires the combined power of all the Avengers present at the Battle of Earth. That effectively makes her the most powerful character in the entire MCU at that moment. Yes, I know, we've said that phrase many times, but the fact is, such power is impossible to integrate into a long-term story. Unless they make her disappear, which is likely, or drastically reduce her abilities, it will be almost impossible to use her again without ruining the dramatic tension. That's usually the type of character who fits an explosive finale, but doesn't belong in a long-term story. Anyway, I'm telling you this assuming that the writers at Marvel aren't skilled in this kind of situation, because I can clearly see limits to her powers. And there really is something they can do with her as a Super Skrull. But anyway, let's move on. And then there's Bob, introduced in Thunderbolts. And that's probably the most interesting case. Both the main antagonist of the film and a potential hero, he's not just defined by his physical abilities. The film doesn't just offer a classic confrontation, but an emotional inner struggle, almost spiritual. It's a smart turning point. Marvel demonstrates you can create a very powerful character and still maintain balanced power dynamics, since the conflict occurs on a different level. That doesn't stop them from also showing us Sentry's power in Stark Tower, in a fight against the team. Yes, Sentry is extremely powerful, but he doesn't have to use his full potential. He can easily overpower them, highlighting the threat he poses. The Thunderbolts, Yelena, Red Guardian, Ghost, or John Walker, are much less powerful than him, and they know it, but they don't give up. Rather than confront him directly, they try to reason with, support, and save him from himself. In this case, the danger doesn't end on its own. They are the ones who prevent the catastrophe, and this time it's through strategy, not brute force. It's a dynamic that recalls the best moments of Phase 3 when heroes had to show ingenuity, not just endurance. They're sort of like inverted versions of each other. Aware of their limits, they act differently, intelligently, and it's all the more believable since the Russo brothers directed the post-credits scene, where a limit is set for Bob. If he abuses his powers, he turns into the Void, his dark alter ego. It's a concept that recalls the Banner-Hulk duality. Except here, their power struggle is amplified because Sentry is even more unstable, stronger, and has 3 distinct personalities. A richness that not only guarantees him screen time, but also a rare dramatic complexity in the MCU. Notably, because his identities are less physically separated, which makes him more elusive. The multiverse, trap or escape. Throughout the entire Multiverse saga, only one project really seems to have escaped the usual inconsistencies. That's Loki. Its success likely led Marvel to fully embrace the multiverse. The series proved that it was possible to create colossal stakes without disrupting the main universe. Simply because the action didn't take place in any defined reality where other heroes could have intervened, and after Endgame, Marvel had to go even further. So, the multiverse became the miracle solution. It's no longer just about saving one universe, but all universes. Well, it also meant they had to introduce the new Fox acquisitions with the X-Men and the Fantastic Four. Sure, but it has to be said, Loki clearly opened that door. Jonathan Majors made a strong impression as He Who Remains, laying the groundwork for a major antagonist and convincing Marvel Studios to go in that direction. Even as fans were already speculating about the arrival of Kang. But you see, while the multiverse can be a blessing, it can also become a writing nightmare. When you play with infinity, anything becomes possible. Thousands of variants, realities colliding, unimaginable threats. The only problem is, infinity also means a lack of stakes. Because anyone can come back one way or another, and that also affects power dynamics. What is the point of being the most powerful if none of your actions really have consequences? Not to mention the appearance of cosmic entities among the most powerful ever seen, and that's where the problem lies. Because coexisting with such a multiverse means dealing with overwhelming entities like Eternity, the Living Tribunal, Chthon, Shuma-Gorath, and others. Mythical figures in the comics, but treated with a total lack of respect. Chthon appears in forms that aren't really impressive.
A long time ago, the first demon, Chthon, carved his dark magic into this tomb. Those same spells were transcribed into the Darkhold.
Eternity, as passive as possible, the Living Tribunal, just a few cameos, and Shuma-Gorath turned into Gargantos, just a passing monster in the background of Doctor Strange 2. Given the Celestials' failure, it's hard to see Marvel handling its entities well. An eminent example, Franklin Richards. If he's properly introduced into the MCU, he'll be the greatest power challenge ever faced. Because he's supposed to be able to literally create entire universes, and in this case, the studio won't be able to just nerf him like the others. Well, yes, since he's still a baby in the Fantastic Four, but from what we've heard, he's already capable of doing quite a lot, like the miracle of resurrection. Right now, it's hard to see him fitting in without things falling apart. And then there's Loki, probably once again the most powerful entity in the multiverse today, sitting on the throne as the god of stories, with abilities we can't even comprehend yet. All this leads us to a crucial question: how will Marvel handle power in Avengers Doomsday? What are they going to do with Sentry, who has no clear limits? What will Doctor Doom's true power be? And later, maybe even God Doom. Will Franklin Richards have a real role in this? Or will Thor, Hulk, Wanda, Strange, or Adam Warlock be involved? And if so, to what extent? With what power? And above all, with all this, are we going to see a classic structure like Infinity War? Barons, armies, a final boss, or something completely different? What we do know is that the original plan was the Council of Kangs. Countless variants, all different, all dangerous. No need for henchmen or CGI creatures, the Avengers would have faced only Kangs in all their forms. A major twist compared to Infinity War, and honestly a really fresh idea. But today, is that still the plan for Doomsday? Are we going to see Doombots, or a version of Doom with his own variants? Will he have allies? Maybe even manipulated heroes? What if the real idea was to return to something more tactical? A smart antagonist like Zemo, who would pit the X-Men from one universe against our Avengers in a conflict that's more psychological than cosmic. What's certain is that Avengers 5 will have to bring together all these years of chaos, deal with all its failures, and finally offer a model that's balanced, coherent, epic, and above all, lives up to what the multiverse promises. And for that, good luck. Marvel keeps experimenting with ways to introduce and manage its most powerful characters. Sometimes by limiting them, sometimes by focusing on their psychology, sometimes by sidelining them, but today, we're waiting for them to finally find their stride. From now on, they'll be judged by their actions, first with the Fantastic Four and the arrival of Galactus, then Spider-Man, and finally Avengers Doomsday. If they want the MCU to regain its coherence and rekindle the public's interest, they simply can't afford to make any more mistakes. These characters' fate remains uncertain, but their treatment in upcoming productions will be vital for the future and survival of the Marvel Universe. Meanwhile, remember to stay curious. That's the secret. Bye!